An interesting topic that came up was the cross-border flow of data. From Geneva, we have Pilar Fajarnes. She's Spanish, but she works in UNCTAD, the UN agency responsible for trade. And she published a study on cross-border data flow. She was so kind enough to bring that paper to my office, where also you can find it online. But let me remind you that if you are interested in this topic that is very related to cloud services, evidence that they explained that could be used in cross-border cases. Pilar, can you hear me from there? Hello, Olga. Good morning. I'm speaking from Geneva. Good afternoon for you that you're in Geneva, in Switzerland. Thank you very much for being here. I was telling them about the UNCTAD study and the survey that was conducted by you at the United Nations. I have the publication, however, the printed publication, but you can download the online version. It's great to pursue further knowledge or know-how on these issues. And Pilar, can you share the screen so you can follow that? You can follow the presentation and the timing of your presentation. Thank you very much for inviting UNCTAD to share this presentation. Let me manage the presentation or the PowerPoint directly from here. Can you see it? Yes. Perfect. As Olga said, the Digital Economy Survey is one of the publications made by UNCTAD, and this is the one that was published by the division that is responsible for the digital impact on development. This is published every 2 years. This is the latest release that is on cross-border data flow and who is the receiver of this flow or data flow. The progress that has been made based on the previous publications on value capture in the digital economy, together with this report or the previous report, show clearly what are the dynamics of the digital economy, the prompts for development, especially the fact that the role played by digital platforms and the inequalities that arise out of this topic, especially from the United States and China, and given also the value of the digital economy. The digital economy captures this data, and everything that it revolves around that works on the data that we provide. So data digital become important as a strategic and economic value. Here, Antonio Guterres quotes and underscores the role played by data because it's a social and a strategic value, and this will determine and will affect to a greater or lesser extent the capacity in order to attain the SDGs. The 2030 agenda. Let me start by going over the report. Speaking of inequalities or asymmetries that we are aware of, traditionally we know what the digital divide is. However, we have a digital economy that is increasingly more based on data that evolves pretty fast. As countries get ready to become digital, and that is totally unequal, we have a digital divide. In terms of digital economy, that has been evolving, but in line with the importance that is given to data. Here we have some statistics, but we know full well that there's a digital divide in between countries. And inside the countries, depending on the sector, depending on the urban center, on gender, we have several analyses that we have prepared for the digital divide. Here we have the average internet speed in the most advanced countries compared to developed world, that is 8 less, and internet use in developed countries accounts for 90% compared to 20 in least advanced countries. The worldwide traffic over the internet is very complicated, but this gives us an indication on the internet traffic over the net. In 2022, we consider that it is greater than all traffic up to 2016. And if we consider that the international digital affairs and also the data flows tend to use as an indicator the broadband internet or the internet broadband, even though it's not a perfect indicator, is far from what we may seek as an indicator or as metric, but indicates that the cross-border data flow is basically based on two principal routes: North America, Europe, and the United States and China. However, the digital divide, that is the most traditional one, because of data flows and because of the increasingly importance of data, is related to digital divides or global digital divides. There are two leaders that are the United States and China, and we can prove by indicators related to emerging technologies and digital technologies. For example, in terms of data centers, they control 50% of hyperscale across the world. These are the highest across the world. They account for 94% of startups in artificial intelligence. And for the moment being, these countries have the largest global digital platforms, where they have an increasingly more control on the global supply chain of digital data. Given the COVID-19 pandemic, we have witnessed this dominant factor. So this value chain, by gathering data, transmission, storage, analysis, and use. And the benefit lies in the use of data. What is important to tell you is that there was a need in improving the knowledge of data and what it implies for development. A key feature of data is that they are multidimensional. This data do not imply an economic dimension. On the one hand, we see the value chain of data, and data could be of private ownership, like online advertising that could be targeted through data, the use of digital platforms, as well as cloud services. That would lead also indeed to social value. During the COVID-19 pandemic, by adding data, we witnessed that this allowed policy making to fight the pandemic, like research done on vaccination or for climate change, which are the global challenges that may help with data flow. And for these purposes, it's important to share data both inside the countries and cross-border. Digital data have a non-economic dimension in nature. They have to do with privacy. They may affect human rights, such as freedom of expression, or any other sort of dimensions or considerations, and they may affect national security. So we need to consider data not only from the economic point of view, but from other dimensions beyond economics. Some key highlights are that they differ from goods and services. They are like a totally different beast. That means that cross-border data flows are not of international ownership. These flows vary or differ in line with data. There are different ways or classifications for data, and there are some that could reside at the national level, and there are some that could flow cross borders. There are personal data, non-personal data, more sensitive data, public data or data of public domain, and let's see how we classify it and how do we consider this data in order to establish the access or the way of accessing this data. An aspect that is considered important in policy making is where we store data. This will depend on many factors, such as political aspects, environmental aspects, because storage requires energy availability or its impact. The decision lies in every single country, in line with considering the advantages and disadvantages. A primary concern is data ownership. What we may consider in terms of development, priority should be placed upon data access. Not only ownership is what our concern is, because data is a very important resource. To speak of ownership is very complex. So priority should be placed upon access rights and usage rights. So governance should be placed and revolve around ownership, because there are many differences in preparing countries or training countries to benefit from data. There's a huge divide between sectors and countries within countries as well. And given the power to digital platforms, there are just a few corporations that have access or privileged access to data, and they have unique capabilities to turn this data into artificial intelligence. And this is the way, basically, where we get these benefits. These are developing countries with global platforms. They run the risk that these developing or developed countries basically take over this data or take control of data owned by developing countries, and they get this raw data. So developing countries will have to pay for the processing of those data or the raw data, especially those that were created in a given country, and this will lead to a dependence scheme. This is clearly known in Latin America in terms of raw materials, manufacturing industries, mining industries, and it's something that we need to prevent in terms of development. From the point of view of development, what is important is that developing countries be able to capture the value of the data out of the way they produce it in the domestic level. Although it's very difficult to measure the statistics, if we classify countries in terms of that cross-border data flows and development, we will witness that the incoming data in developed countries, for example, that would be the United States, where, for example, they have global digital platforms, or they have assets with high caliber of technology and very skilled talent in IT. China would be a developing country that has these data flows. Now, the rest of the countries would be outgoing data distributed in developing and developed countries, having different capabilities in line with their digital platforms or not. We may guess that at the regional level, in the case of Latin America, Mercado Libre, for example, is a very powerful digital platform. So Argentina will be well positioned in contrast with China in terms of incoming data. And given this scenario, we are going to draw some conclusions. Policymaking in connection with digital data and cross-border data flows are increasingly more important. These policies are necessary to maximize all benefits for the data economy by minimizing risks, the inherent risks in this environment in order to result into equalities of having this data, unlike the situation that we undergo today, because we live in a jungle that is not very well regulated at the international level, where digital platforms could own most of the benefits or benefit from this data, and to prevent all conflicts of interest. One of the things that we need to underscore is that streamlining processes like demanding data on the one end or localization of the data on the other will require limited use for the SDGs. That is why we need to find commitments to find or to reach consensus. The objective of which would be that internet governance of data should adopt a comprehensive, holistic perspective, given the multidimension of data, multilaterally, and integrating all the stakeholders. Now, given this scenario, what we intended to do is to provide a survey on what the state of affairs was. This is ever changing, and this report was produced a year ago. However, in general terms, I would say that it's applicable. If we have a look at this, there are three spheres of influence that presuppose a threat over the global economy, because they have a different approach from internet governance. On the one hand, we have the United States that is highly focused on the private sector, China that is owned by the state, and the European Union, where they focus data based on the individuals and their fundamental values. This sort of approach has to do with their expansion strategies across the world. The United States expands through corporations, China by the Silk Road, digitally supported or fully supported by the state, and the European Union is doing this in terms of regulations, such as being a worldwide regulation model or regulatory model, and by signing agreements with countries. So there's a risk of fragmenting the internet space that will lead into conflicts with the main stakeholders, such as the United States and China, because there's a race of dominating these technologies to gain strategic advantages. At the same time, given the scenario, the digital global platforms are expanding their own data ecosystems. This fragmentation does not help with development because it goes against the original spirit of the internet, and probably it's not going to favor developing countries either, because it's not reasonable. I mean, developing countries in general terms, they have commercial or trade ties with developed countries, so it would be favorable for them to pick one or the other. In economic terms, what is desirable is the interoperability that would produce better results, since fragmentation could have negative effects detrimental to structures having oligopolies, influences of governments, and pressures from them, and will affect collaboration in between jurisdictions. Now, given the lack of a regulatory system for cross-border data flow, what happens is that countries need to regulate. They have no choice but to regulate data in order to attain policy making objectives, development objectives. And now, in line with what has happened recently, we were able to map the policies at the national level, as Olga well explained. For example, she urged you to analyze this in detail. Like, for example, having a universal solution, because there's a lack of universal solution to regulate cross-border data flow, whether it is technological, political, social, economic, cultural, institutional conditions, determine in a way what is the policy making to be applicable. Is more restricted or liberal enforcement. And this is related to public interest, different policies, and what varies among countries is the emphasis that is placed or priorities placed, like, for example, economic development, privacy rights and other human rights, the enforcement of law, or national security. And there are many legal instruments that can be enforced or that are applicable right now. Here you have an example of them. What clearly shows is that there are many aspects that we use for regulation through different ministries, and that is one of the reasons why we highly recommend, and these are seen in the guidelines of the digital economy, that we should have a comprehensive approach for all ministries and departments to have interoperability among them, because this topic is pervasive, affecting all arenas, all spheres, and all society. We perform an analysis of what's going on at the regional and the international level that revealed different agreements that address data flows. There is an important part in the regional and commercial and international agreements on economic trade. For example, at the worldwide level, we have the Joint Initiative on Economic or Electronic Trade or Commerce that includes agreements that are bilateral treaties, agreements on data, and some other initiatives that, for example, revolve around more specific issues such as privacy. In the broader aspect of the OECD, however, if we consider Latin America as a region, I'm sorry that this slide is in English, but you have the data protection channel, the agenda for Latin America and the Caribbean, and other examples that are in this listing. However, the result, given the analysis of the regulatory framework, was produced at the national and the international level, demonstrating that there are limitations in its scope, both in connection with these topics and geography, and because of their geography. The fact that data are multidimensional, this goes beyond regulations in connection with international trade or in connection with privacy. And in its geography, what we notice is that these data pose a global challenge. And facing this challenge at the regional level means that it's significant to have regional stances. However, from the point of view of internet governance, this will imply that we should have data governance at the global level as well. Something that is missing from the slide, because it was done later on, the African Union in Africa, for example, created a regulatory data framework to find common interests. Given the examples where representativeness in the global negotiations could be complex, it could be positive to establish regional strategies. with the aim to enhance global governance. Because if not, it's going to be difficult to facilitate this data in an equitable way while mitigating those risks. To draw some conclusions, let me tell you that we need to seek a global framework for data governance that should benefit the population at large and the planet. The idea was to underscore a common point of interest to share all the objectives that we should attain, that we consider that we should prevent further inequalities, to prevent data from being traded, especially since they're digital assets, because they should benefit the society at large, to prevent further fragmentation of the digital space, to improve trust and confidence of the digital economy and reduce the uncertainties, to face the challenges of policymaking in order to face dominant positions of those global digital platforms, and to consider the effects of national policies on other countries. The objective is to have data flow in between countries as much as necessary, responding to the SDGs. In line with the lines of actions that we may have with data, we consider that it's important to establish agreements on definitions, taxonomies, on defining or definitions of data, to establish conditions of data access. We need to improve the metrics, what data flows are, to manage data as worldwide public assets, and to explore new ways of data governance, to strike agreements on digital or principal rights, to develop regulations or rules, and to foster international cooperation for digital platform governance. We may think in this case on the importance of competition policies, even though for now these are the national authorities that regulate this, we are faced with international agencies. That's why we want to promote this cooperation. The same goes for taxes. Increasingly more, we need international cooperation to prevent these digital platforms to evade taxes. That means they need to fulfill the payment of those taxes, especially when where they conduct their business activities. So the UN should play a key role. As I said before, there's a whole set of countries, like the least developed countries. The LCDs, they have representativeness issues in regional and worldwide representation with limited representation, so the UN could be the most exclusive forum or space for representing those countries. We believe that the worldwide debate on data governance and data flows should be inclusive, and therefore this should be discussed at the core of the United Nations. So we should create a new institutional world framework that could be multilateral in nature, multi-stakeholder, and multidisciplinary, that could lead in a new coordination agency enshrined in the United Nations. We believe that given the complexity and the context and the topic, it will require new ways of governance. And this new coordination agency for policy making should have a solid or strong mandate and new competencies based on the existing benefits of the UN or beyond. Finally, Let me conclude that there are many countries that they don't have the resources to enhance their capabilities to benefit from this data. That is why it is important to help those countries or to contribute so that they can improve the state of affairs, to improve resources, and to have more capabilities. There's an indication that the situation is unfavorable for helping trade, for communications, and e-communication. In 2019, where we were well below the average of what the Millennium Goals set forth. This will help to improve capabilities to capture data by improving knowledge on data and the implications for development, and to come up with data national strategies, to formulate regulatory frameworks, and to guarantee the effective involvement of all developing countries in these international processes. And having said this, these were the highlights published in my report, which is long, interesting, but these are the key takeaways of the report. Thank you very much. Round of applause for Pilar. We have a Telegram chat and they shared the link. I know that is a very interesting presentation. She will summarize the topics. We have a few questions. We don't have time, but are there any questions? Gabby has a question. Valentina, there is Lily says, if together with the ISO on data treatment, can you get a homogeneous solution to the activity of the 108 plus convention? And if it's necessary, from Mexico, they're asking this, if it's necessary to consider the possibility that the regulatory framework be global to have better data flow. And Gabby has another question there. Gabby, you have the floor. Over to you. Pilar, thank you very much for the presentation. In Argentina, we're very interested in your report on data transfer published by UNTAD, because poses the challenge of creating a new stance for developing countries, very similar to what we had with the separate in theory exchange inequalities for international trade. And given the new data economy, your position in the report is to focus on the raw material of data, and in terms of international cooperation, to provide assistance for technology transfer and for technology or digital skills. I know that it's very comprehensive, it's very detailed. From Argentina, we would like to drive all these topics that are included in the report by saying that we should prevent the inequalities in these terms. So we're working on this. Do you have any contributions or thoughts on technology transfer, especially not only as international cooperation, but considering other things? Pilar? Any thoughts? In connection with the ISO standards, one of the measures that we were preparing is to seek standards, but we should find more. It's just one contribution and it helps, not just ISO. And in connection with Convention 108 plus, 108 plus. As I work in English, I cannot really hear or understand sometimes Spanish very well, but it doesn't cover all countries. We should have global international cooperation and global governance, because data governance should be in different tiers. This was explained in the report. That started globally and then regionally, and then at the national level or we can take it to an individual level because all individuals need to manage our data one way or another. So we need to improve our knowledge, our expertise on what can be done in order to protect our data. But there's no doubt that we should have global governance because this has a global scope. So it requires from us and from countries to have further coordination, although we have a very difficult context and many global challenges that we're faced with. This is the dilemma that we have today. There are global challenges. However, we're pursuing inward-looking approaches. In connection with the information exchange, I think is one of the thoughts from the audience, but let me underscore that especially by the UNTAD mandate, we're seeking integration to benefit developing countries and the world economy. From what we experience in many of the discussions held on data governance, is that they highly focus on anything but on data distribution. And this was relegated. And as it was set aside, we were interested in having value adding in our report by focusing on the need that these benefits be distributed equitably. And the issue of the raw data, that means the raw material used in the data, it was important to analyze it for the goods and services that we know of, because data regulation has been tried on or has been analyzed from the trade economic point of view. And it was regulated and it was in the spirit of free trade. However, if we consider data as raw material or raw data, and in this process we end up in digital intelligence, the result of this data could be considered a service in itself, but the raw data, the raw material, is not regulated in any way. And it should be regulated because we should prevent the use of these powerful companies or digital platforms to own this data, especially what is going on in China and in the United States, that own the raw data from developing countries to later sell them the processed data. Thank you very much, Pilar. I would like to commend you for your research conducted in this field. It's really great. And we believe that data are the basis of what's coming, like artificial intelligence, the exchange of information, advertising, marketing, the advances of large digital platforms. We gotta see how this evolves, but your report is a building block to have enough expertise and know-how. Greetings from Argentina. We'll see you in person or virtually. Thank you very much. Goodbye.